Hello, my name is Monique Hyman, and I'm a first-year PhD student in history at Florida State University. This thesis focuses on the representation of African American and Mexican American history in state-adopted 8th grade public school Texas textbooks between 1965 and 1980. The periodization of this study covers a highly polarized period of American politics, the Civil Rights Movement, and the period of revolutionary multiculturalism that succeeded it. This research analyzes the content of these textbooks as institutional responses to the civil rights movement and subsequent power movements of Blacks and Chicanos. This thesis contains 3 chapters, each covering 5-year periods. The texts adopted in Texas from 1965 to 1970 were emblematic of the dominant strand of American history that existed in public school curricula in the mid 20th century. African Americans were represented as feeble minded and not interested in their own freedom. Mexican American history was only presented in instances of war and foreign conflict, presenting them as foreign threats to the United States. From 1970 to 1975, African American historical representations evolved. However, this was done using the contribution approach, coupled with superficial discussions of slavery and oppression. Instead of increasing historical understanding, these clashing narratives produce incoherent stories of extraordinary minority success and isolated instances of racism. Mexican American history is distorted further into projections of foreign conflict and threat to world stability and democracy. The freedom struggles of Mexican Americans, Mexicans, and Latin Americans were presented as civil wars derived from civil instability that resulted in dictatorial leadership and corruption. The progression of Mexican American and African American histories adopted in Texas textbooks from 1965 to 1980 was mixed at best. Through the contribution approach, the inclusion of minority histories measurably increased, while the most damning representations of these groups prevailed through this period and into the 1990s. African Americans were presented as politically inept. Mexican Americans were presented as descendants of war hungry dictatorships and corrupt revolutions. This presented white Americans as superior in politics and society. Sanitized historical depictions ultimately won out in the final quarter of the 20th century. For decades, many debates over curricula and textbook adoption in Texas have centered on racial and ethnic inclusion, with African American and Mexican American histories at the forefront of this discourse. Texas is one of the largest textbook buyers in the country. Its adoption decisions thus heavily influenced adoption decisions throughout the national textbook market. Additionally, Texas stands at the epicenter of the immigration narrative within early American history, a narrative shrouded with forced labor, genocide, and colonial expansion. It therefore offers a unique point of departure to study how the teaching of history reflects history itself. Thank you.